They say a man builds his life brick by brick, beam by beam, thinking each piece adds to an unshakable fortress against the storms of the world. He stacks his pride high, measures his worth in the things he gathers, in the smooth finish of a paid-off car, the solid feel of a roof over his head, the quiet hum of a healthy bank account. He believes these are the anchors, the proof he's made something of himself, that he's safe. But sometimes life ain't a fortress. It's a sandcastle on the shore, sculpted with painstaking effort, only for the tide to turn, silent and relentless, washing away every last grain until nothing but bare, wet sand remains. It's in that moment, when the last wave recedes and the horizon stretches empty, that a man truly finds out what he's made of. Dale was a man who understood that kind of tide better than most. 48 years old, his life hammered out on the anvil of a machine shop floor. They say a man builds his life brick by brick, beam by beam, thinking each piece adds to an unshakable fortress against the storms of the world. He stacks his pride high, measures his worth in the things he gathers, in the smooth finish of a paid-off car, the solid feel of a roof over his head, the quiet hum of a healthy bank account. He believes these are the anchors, the proof he's made something of himself, that he's safe. But sometimes life ain't a fortress. It's a sandcastle on the shore, sculpted with painstaking effort, only for the tide to turn, silent and relentless, washing away every last grain until nothing but bare, wet sand remains. It's in that moment, when the last wave recedes and the horizon stretches empty, that a man truly finds out what he's made of. Dale was a man who understood that kind of tide better than most. 48 years old, his life hammered out on the anvil of a machine shop floor, he carried the marks of it. His face was a roadmap of forgotten dreams and hard-won battles, etched with faint lines around eyes that had seen too much and still managed to hold a stubborn glint of resilience. Not the loud kind of defiance, but a quiet, deep-seated refusal to break. His hands, calloused and strong, were a testament to a lifetime of honest labor, fingers thick at the knuckles, skin rough from grease and steel, capable of both mending an engine and gently stroking his daughter's hair. He wasn't a talker, Dale. Never had been, he observed. He listened. He nodded more than he spoke, but when he offered a smile, it was a warm, genuine thing, like a crack in a storm cloud letting a sliver of sun through. Inside that quiet man, beneath the surface of dependable calm, there lived a ghost, a cold, knotting fear that coiled in his gut, a whisper of failure threatening to return, to snatch away the quiet stability he'd fought tooth and nail to build. He carried a silent hope, too, a fragile, persistent wish for Sarah, Lily, and Tom, that their lives would be easier, more secure than his had often been. And there was a pride, fierce and unspoken, in his ability to endure, to keep showing up day after day, no matter what. He just kept going. It was what he did. The 5 a.m. alarm was a blunt instrument, cutting through the thin veil of sleep like a saw through soft wood. Dale never hit snooze. There was no time for that kind of luxury. Before the sun even thought about stretching its own sleepy limbs, he was already rolling out of bed, the floorboards groaning a familiar tune under his weight. He'd pad through the dim hallway of their modest ranch house, past Lily's closed door where she was likely dreaming of college applications and a life beyond their small industrial town, and Tom's, where he was probably lost in some video game world even in his sleep. The kitchen was still dark, smelling faintly of yesterday's coffee. He'd start the new brew, the gurgle, and hiss a familiar morning symphony, then pull on his work clothes, faded jeans, a heavy flannel shirt, steel-toed boots that had seen more mileage than his old pickup. Sarah would usually be stirring by the time he finished his coffee, her own eyes a little heavy, but always with a gentle touch as she packed his lunch. A sandwich, an apple, maybe some leftover spaghetti. Simple, sufficient. Then it was out the door into the pre-dawn chill, the faint glow of streetlights painting long shadows on the quiet streets. The drive to the factory was a well-worn path, a silent meditation on the day ahead. The rhythmic thrum of the engine, the glow of the dashboard lights, the same stretch of road passing under his wheels, day in and day out. At the plant, the air hung thick with the metallic tang of oil and the distant roar of machinery already alive. His station was in the grinding department, a cacophony of shrieking metal and vibrating concrete. 8 hours, sometimes 10, standing, lifting, tightening, inspecting. The work was endless, repetitive, and unforgiving. Each widget, each bolt, each plate had to be perfect. The constant drone of the machines became a part of him, an echo in his bones, a dull ache that never quite left, even after his shift was over. He wasn't building dreams here. He was making parts for other people's machines, ensuring someone else's assembly line kept moving. He was a cog in a much larger, faceless machine himself. Every payday, the small thrill of seeing the number in his account was quickly overshadowed by the relentless arithmetic of bills. The mortgage payment, steady and demanding. The car insurance, health insurance, groceries, school supplies, Lily's college fund slowly, painfully growing. Tom's braces that seemed to cost a small fortune. There was always more month than money. Always. He'd sit at the kitchen table late at night, the glow of the desk lamp illuminating the pile of envelopes, moving numbers around in his head, a constant, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface. He wasn't a rich man, not by a long shot, but he was a provider. That, he told himself, was enough. It had to be. He had a roof over their heads, food on the table, and clothes on their backs. It wasn't the life he'd once envisioned, but it was their life, and he guarded it with everything he had. The quiet pride in his ability to endure mixed with the constant dread of not quite making it. It was a tightrope walk he performed every single day. That tightrope walk was his daily rhythm, a silent internal performance. He'd watch Sarah sometimes across the kitchen table, her brow furrowed slightly as she balanced the checkbook, a faint line of worry etched between her eyes that mirrored his own. They rarely spoke of the depth of the struggle, not directly. It was understood, an unspoken agreement that mentioning it too often would only give it more power. Instead, they communicated through gestures. The careful slicing of an extra chicken breast to stretch at another meal, the swift, almost imperceptible shake of Sarah's head when Lily mentioned a new dress for the school dance, the way Dale would linger a moment longer in the driveway before heading to his second shift, just to share a few more quiet minutes with Tom kicking a worn-out soccer ball in the yard. Their modest ranch house, meticulously maintained, was a testament to their grit. Every loose board nailed, every peeling patch of paint touched up, every weed pulled from the small, beloved garden in the back was a quiet act of defiance against the slow creep of decay that threatened everything. It wasn't the sprawling, impressive home he'd once envisioned, but it was theirs. The worn armchair in the living room, a hand-me-down from Sarah's parents, held the shape of his body perfectly after a long day. The faint scent of Sarah's baking lingered in the kitchen on Tuesdays, a comforting anchor in the week. These were the small, sturdy joys he clung to, the tangible evidence of what he was fighting for. But even amidst these comforts, a shadow clung to him. It was a cold, insistent whisper from a past he'd tried to bury under layers of sweat and hard work. He'd walk through the factory floor, the rhythmic clang and hiss of the machines a constant reminder of his current station, and he'd see a younger man, fresh out of trade school, full of big ideas, full of pride. The Dale who had believed in a different future. The Dale who had built something. That man, before Dale, had been almost reckless in his confidence. He started his own small fabrication shop years ago, pouring everything he had, every waking hour, every last penny into it. He'd bought the best machines, hired a couple of good men, and had taken a fierce, almost arrogant pride in the quality of his work, the hum of his own equipment, the smell of cut metal, the tangible reality of a business he had created. He'd believed that wealth was measured in square footage, in the number of orders on the books, in the healthy balance in the bank. He'd walked taller then, a man who thought he had the world by the tail. He'd projected an image of success, a carefully constructed edifice of prosperity that he believed defined his very worth. He remembered the feel of a new suit, the satisfying thud of his own office door closing, the way he'd nodded to the bank manager, an equal. He'd been too proud, maybe, too vulnerable to the idea that it could all disappear. Now working this assembly line, the ghost of that ambitious, confident man haunted his quiet moments. He'd see the successful contractors driving their new trucks past the factory gates, the well-dressed men with easy smiles on the local news, and a familiar ache would settle in his gut. It wasn't envy, not exactly. It was a deep-seated fear, a cold hand squeezing his chest, reminding him how quickly everything could unravel. He knew what it felt like to have it all, and then to watch it all crumble. The gap between the man he was then and the factory worker he was now stretched wide, a chasm filled with buried dreams and the bitter taste of failure. He'd always wanted to build things, to see his own vision take shape, to leave a mark. Instead, he was making parts for other people's visions, an anonymous contributor to an unknown whole. The dream of independence, of being his own boss, of providing a legacy beyond a pension plan, felt like a betrayal he'd inflicted upon himself. It wasn't just the memory of lost money. It was the memory of lost self. The quiet hope for stability for his family was his guiding star now, but the fear that he might somehow, somewhere, fail them again, that the past might repeat itself, was a persistent, gnawing fear. He carried it silently like a stone in his pocket, too heavy to discard, too private to share. He shouldered these burdens alone, pushing down the doubts, the what-ifs, the regrets, convinced that revealing their weight would only make them heavier. The grit that kept him going was also the wall that kept others out, even those closest to him. It wasn't a sudden explosion, not a car crash or a shouted argument. It was quieter than that, a slow erosion like water wearing down stone. The first real crack appeared not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of an envelope hitting the doormat. Dale remembered that Tuesday like it was yesterday, though years had fallen away since. Sarah was at work, the kids at school. He'd just come in from the yard, dirt still clinging to his work boots, the smell of damp earth in his nostrils. Among the usual junk mail and circulars lay a thick cream-colored envelope, heavier than it should be, with the logo of the regional bank stamped precisely in the top left corner. He picked it up, a strange chill running through him even before he saw the words. He recognized the typeface, the official weight of it, the sort of paper they used when the news wasn't good. His thumb traced the embossed bank seal. He knew, he just knew. The world seemed to hold its breath. He tore it open slowly, as if delaying the inevitable would somehow change the message inside. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, the bolded paragraphs, the dates. Notice of foreclosure. The words punched the air out of his lungs. He sat down heavily on the bottom step of the staircase, the envelope crumpling in his trembling hand. It wasn't just the house on the line, that was just the last domino. The business, the one he'd poured every last drop of sweat and every penny he'd ever saved into, the dream he'd chased since he was a young man, was already a ghost. The liquidation had been a brutal, drawn-out affair, a public dismantling of his pride and his future. He'd watched numb as strangers walked through his workshop, tagging equipment, his tools, the very machines that had hummed with the promise of a better life. Each click of the auctioneer's hammer had been a nail in the coffin of his ambition. The final straw had been the day they'd cleared out the last piece of machinery, leaving nothing but dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that cut through the high windows. An empty space where purpose used to be, a profound, gut-wrenching void. He remembered standing there, surrounded by nothing but echoes, the faint scent of oil and metal lingering in the air like a phantom limb. He'd lost it all. Everything he thought defined him, everything he'd built was gone. Just gone. The silence of that empty workshop had been deafening, a roar of failure in his ears. That night's sleep was a cruel joke. He found himself on the couch at 3 a.m., the house dark and silent around him except for the rhythmic sigh of the old refrigerator. Sarah and the kids were asleep upstairs, their breathing soft and even oblivious to the storm raging inside him. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, trying to push away the images, the memories, the crushing weight of what lay ahead. It was just him now, alone in the dark, with nowhere to hide from the brutal honesty of his situation. What had his life become? He, Dale, the man who was supposed to be a success, the provider, the rock. Now, he was a factory worker, punching a clock, living paycheck to paycheck, and staring down the barrel of losing the very roof over his family's heads. The shame burned hotter than any fever. He remembered the eager young man, full of piss and vinegar, ready to conquer the world with a toolbox and a dream. That man was gone, replaced by this ghost of himself, haunted by the specter of past mistakes. He could feel the fear in his gut, a cold, clenching knot. Not just for himself, but for Sarah, for Lily, for Tom. They deserved better than this constant tightrope walk, this endless struggle. He de-promised them stability, a good life. He de-promised himself that he'd never let them down again. And now, he was right back at the precipice, looking down into the same dark chasm he thought he'd climbed out of years ago. The air felt heavy, suffocating. He thought of all the sacrifices, all the late nights, all the times he'd pushed himself to the breaking point. For what? To end up here, a failure, a statistic, a man with nothing but a quiet sense of dread and a broken promise echoing in his chest. The silence of the house magnified his despair, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a hammer blow to his already fractured spirit. He was adrift, unmoored, surrounded by the wreckage of a life he'd painstakingly tried to build, and it felt like there was no solid ground left anywhere. He closed his eyes, wishing for an escape, for a single moment of peace from the relentless self-recrimination. He wished for morning, but dreaded it too. He closed his eyes, wishing for an escape, for a single moment of peace from the relentless self-recrimination. He wished for morning, but dreaded it too. And then in that suffocating darkness, something shifted. It wasn't a roar, not a sudden burst of defiance. It was quieter than that, deeper, a slow, grinding realization that settled in his bones. This wasn't living. This was just waiting for the next shoe to drop, constantly looking over his shoulder, a prisoner in his own mind. He was tired, bone-weary of the fear, the shame, the endless cycle of trying to outrun a past that clung to him like a shadow. He lay there, watching the first faint hint of gray creep under the blinds, painting the edges of the room in a dull, muted light. And in that nascent dawn, a quiet, enough, formed in his mind. Not enough of fighting, but enough of this particular way of fighting, alone, in silence, letting the specter of bankruptcy and failure define him. Didn't know what came next. There was no grand plan, no sudden blueprint for recovery. Just the stark, unvarnished truth. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep letting the fear gnaw at him, hollow him out until there was nothing left but dread. He didn't want his kids to see that man, the one who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without ever asking for help, eventually buckling under it. He didn't want to be the lesson of what happens when you give up. The alarm shrilled at 5 a.m., a harsh intrusion into the fragile peace of his resolve. For a moment his hand hovered, ready to slam it into silence, to pull the covers over his head and disappear back into the hollow comfort of sleep. The familiar ache in his joints, the dull throb behind his eyes, the heavy blanket of despair, they all called to him, promising temporary oblivion. But then he saw it, not with his eyes, but with that new, quiet determination. He saw the worn-out running shoes Sarah had bought him years ago, still sitting by the back door, a silent testament to a healthier, more hopeful time. He hadn't touched them in months, probably years. He used to run, not fast, not far, but enough to clear his head, to feel the blood pump, to remember he was alive. His stomach clenched, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening. What's the point? The voice in his head whispered. You're still broke, still working a dead-end job. Still lost everything. But a different voice, one he hadn't heard in a long time, stirred. You're still here. You're still breathing. That's a point. He swung his legs out of bed, the cold floor biting at his bare feet. Each movement felt like wading through thick mud. He walked past the kitchen, past Sarah's sleeping form, towards the back door. The shoes were dusty, laces stiff. He picked them up, the weight of them surprisingly heavy in his hands. Outside, the air was sharp, biting, smelling of damp earth and coming rain. The first streaks of orange bled into the deep navy sky. His lungs burned almost immediately as he forced his legs into a slow, clumsy jog. Every muscle screamed in protest. His knees ached. His breath came in ragged gasps. He wanted to stop, desperately, to turn around, crawl back into the warmth, and pretend this crazy idea had never happened. He felt ridiculous, a man his age, out of shape, wheezing his way down the deserted street. It wasn't about being fast or strong or even good. It was just about moving, about putting one foot in front of the other, even when every cell in his body told him to quit. It was about proving to himself in that raw, primal way that he could still do something, that the strength wasn't gone, just buried. This wasn't rebuilding a bank account. It was rebuilding Dale, piece by agonizing piece. And with each painful short stride, a tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of the gloom began to recede, replaced by the sheer, stubborn will to keep moving. That first morning, coming back to the house, he felt like he'd been run over by a truck. Every muscle screamed a protest he hadn't heard in years, a deep, throbbing ache that settled into his bones. Sarah was just stirring, the smell of coffee beginning to waft from the kitchen. He showered quickly, the hot water a temporary balm on his abused body, then dressed for the plant. He kept quiet about his early morning excursion, not because he was ashamed, but because it felt too fragile to speak of, too personal to expose to the light just yet. It was his secret, his small, stubborn act of defiance against the crushing weight of his life. The next day was harder. His calves felt like concrete, his hamstrings locked solid. The alarm blared at 5 a.m. and a groan escaped him before he could swallow it back. No, a voice whispered, just sleep. One day won't matter. You're too old for this. You're too tired. He lay there for a long moment, staring at the dimly lit ceiling, the internal war raging in the quiet dark. His mind supplied 1,000 reasons to stay in bed, each one more convincing than the last. You'll just injure yourself. You have a long day at work. You need your rest. But then a flicker of that raw memory, the empty workshop, the cold, stark realization that everything he had built was gone. What's one more ache? What's one more discomfort? Slowly, deliberately, he swung his legs out. Each step towards the door was a monumental effort, a negotiation with his own pain. He didn't run far, just a block, then back, a shambling, pathetic shuffle more than a jog. But he did it. Laced up the shoes and he stepped out. Day 3, day 5, day 7. It became a ritual of resistance. Some mornings he would just walk, pushing his protesting body through the chill air, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes just 10. There were mornings when the rain was coming down in sheets or the wind bit with icy teeth, and he'd stand at the back door, shivering, battling himself. He'd think of Lily and Tom, still sleeping, of Sarah, who deserved better than a man who just gave up. And something deep inside, that old factory grit would kick in. The kind of grit that showed up for the morning shift even when you had the flu, the kind that tightened bolts until your fingers bled, the kind that knew a job wasn't done until it was done. One Tuesday morning, exhausted from a double shift and a fitful night, he actually failed. The alarm sounded, he swatted it, rolled over, and plunged back into a heavy, dreamless sleep. He woke an hour later, heart pounding, the sun already glaring through the window. A wave of shame washed over him, hot and bitter. "See, you can't even stick to this." The voice was back, insidious, reminding him of every mistake, every broken promise he'd ever made to himself. He drove to work that day feeling hollow, a profound sense of having let himself down. The monotony of the press machine, the clanging of metal, usually a familiar rhythm, felt like a judgment. He was doing everything he could to rebuild, and he'd already stumbled. But as the day wore on, a different thought began to form. So what? He'd missed one day. Did that erase the 6 he'd managed before? Did that mean he was doomed to repeat the past? No, it just meant he was human. It meant he was tired. It meant he had to try again. The thought wasn't a roar, not even a shout, just a quiet, stubborn hum beneath the surface noise of the factory. Tomorrow. Tomorrow I try again. That night he laid out his running clothes, a silent promise to himself. He wasn't aiming for perfection. He was aiming for persistence. He was aiming for the belief that even after a stumble, you still had the legs to get back up. The fight wasn't in the running itself, but in the choice to keep lacing up the shoes day after agonizing day. The next morning, the alarm went off at 5 a.m. sharp, and Dale was out of bed before the last echo faded. He dressed in the dark, tying his laces with a deliberate tug, a small ritual against the larger chaos of the world. The cold bite of the early air was a shock, but this time it felt less like a punishment and more like a bracing challenge. He ran, feeling the familiar burn in his lungs, the ache in his knees, but there was a subtle difference. The shame of yesterday had been replaced by a quiet resolve. He wasn't perfect, no, but he was showing up. And in showing up, he was choosing. He was choosing to fight. Days turned into weeks. The running became less of a dreaded chore and more of a non-negotiable part of his day, a pillar around which he started to build other small acts of discipline. He began bringing his lunch from home, not just to save money, but to reclaim a little control over his day, packing it with the same care he now laced his running shoes. He started listening more at dinner, really listening to Lily chatter about her college applications, and Tom excitedly recount a play from his basketball practice. He'd always been there physically, but now his mind was there too, less shrouded by the ghost of past failures. Sarah noticed first. One evening, as he methodically tightened a loose kitchen cabinet hinge, a repair he'd put off for months, she watched him, a small smile playing on her lips. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "you haven't hummed while you work in a long time." He paused, a screwdriver in his hand, a little surprised himself. He hadn't even realized he was humming. It wasn't a happy-go-lucky tune, just a low, contented rumble, a sound of quiet engagement. He looked at her, and the warm, genuine smile that used to feel like a mask now came naturally. It felt like coming home to himself. The spark returned not as a flash fire, but as embers glowing steadily in the dark. He wasn't out of the woods financially, not by a long shot. The bills were still relentless, the factory still loud, the future still uncertain. But Dale started to see the gaps, the small spaces where he could apply his grit, his practical mind. He started taking on extra shifts when they came up, not with a sigh of resignation, but with a quiet determination. He helped old Mr. Henderson fix his fence on a Saturday, refusing payment, just enjoying the feel of wood in his hands, the satisfaction of a job done right. These weren't grand gestures. They were tiny, deliberate acts of rebuilding, brick by brick, not a house, but a life. Weeks bled into months. The gray shroud that had hung over Dale for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a clarity he hadn't felt since before the bankruptcy. He was still the same quiet, dependable man, but the resilience in his eyes was no longer a flicker. It was a steady flame. His shoulders, once habitually hunched, seemed broader, less burdened. He'd fixed the kitchen cabinet, then the leaky faucet, then recaulked the bathroom. His modest ranch house, always well-maintained, now felt like a testament to persistent care, not just a holding pattern. The small garden out back, which he'd neglected during his darkest times, began to flourish under his renewed attention, each budding plant a quiet promise of future growth. One crisp autumn evening, after a particularly grueling shift, he found himself sitting on the porch swing with Sarah. The kids were inside, the sounds of their laughter a warm hum. He leaned back, listening to the crickets, a strange peace settling over him. "You've changed, Dale," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, echoing what she'd noticed months ago. "Not, changed who you are, but like you found something." He took a deep breath, the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves filling his lungs. He thought about that empty workshop, the crushing weight of everything he'd lost, everything he thought he was. He thought about the shame, the fear, the 3 a.m. sweats. And then he thought about the 5 a.m. runs, the quiet hum, the fixed hinges, the blossoming garden. He finally spoke, his voice low, gravelly, but firm. "I used to think being rich meant having a fat wallet. Had a decent one for a while, remember. Thought that was it, thought that was me. But then it was gone, all of it. The business, the savings, the pride." He paused, a faraway look in his eyes. "Turns out the real gold ain't in the wallet. The real gold is in knowing you can lose it all and still stand up, dust yourself off, and start over. Money comes and goes, Sarah, believe me, I know that now, but the fight in you, the knowing that you can rebuild no matter what, that's what you keep." He reached out, taking her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "That's what nobody can ever take away." And so it is. For every man who stands at the crossroads of loss and despair, there is a path back not to what was, but to what can be. The true measure of a man's wealth is not in the height of his towers, but in the depth of his foundation and the strength of his hands to lay new stone again and again. Some treasures are buried in the ground, but the greatest are forged in the fires of endurance. Sarah squeezed his hand back, her thumb stroking the rough skin of his knuckles. She'd watched him, of course. Watched the light die in his eyes, then slowly, painstakingly rekindle. She'd seen the shadow of shame lift, replaced by a different kind of quiet dignity. The Dale sitting beside her now wasn't merely the man she'd married. He was the man forged in the crucible of absolute loss, refined and tempered. He was stronger, not in the way he'd once measured strength by the weight of his bank account, but in the steadfastness of his spirit. "I know," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the faint, distant glow of a porch light from a neighbor's house. "I saw it too. How it ate at you, how you felt, stripped bare. But I also saw you pick up that first shovel. I saw you stay up late fixing that leaky faucet when the old Dale would have just called someone. I saw you coax life out of that patch of dirt out back that everyone else had given up on." She turned her head, meeting his eyes, a soft, understanding smile on her lips. I think maybe I learned it too. Not the same way, not that deep gut punch, but watching you, watching us. We didn't break, we bent, we swayed, but we didn't break." Dale nodded slowly, the familiar tightness in his chest easing, a feeling he now recognized as a lifetime of holding too much in, finally beginning to unravel. He used to pride himself on being the rock, the one who bore all burdens silently. He'd seen asking for help as a sign of weakness, a crack in his formidable facade. The bankruptcy had shattered that facade entirely, forcing him to confront the terrifying vulnerability beneath. But in its place, something more resilient had grown, the ability to admit fear, to acknowledge struggle, and perhaps most profoundly, to accept comfort and understanding from the one person who knew him better than anyone. The laughter from inside swelled for a moment, then softened again. Lily and Tom. They hadn't truly understood the magnitude of what had happened, not like he and Sarah had. They'd seen the house stay, the food remain on the table, the routine mostly intact. They'd seen him go to work every day, come home tired but present. He'd shielded them instinctively from the deepest anxieties, though he knew they'd sensed the shift, the palpable tension that had hung in the air like a storm cloud in those early days. Now, listening to them, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. They were his anchors, his reason to rebuild not just his own spirit, but the very foundation of their family's security. "It ain't just about starting over, Sarah," he added, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. "It's about how you start over. For a while there, after the notice came, I just felt hollowed out, like a tree that's been struck by lightning, all bark and no core. I kept thinking, how will I ever get back what I had? But that was the wrong question. It was never about getting back. It was about getting forward, about finding new growth, even if it looked different, even if it wasn't the towering oak I once imagined. Maybe it's a sturdy maple now, giving good shade, standing firm." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the darkened outline of his small garden. He remembered the first time he'd really looked at it, not as a chore, but as a project. A tiny patch of earth, neglected, overgrown, but holding the promise of life beneath the tangled weeds. He'd spent weekends digging, turning the soil, amending it, his hands aching, his mind surprisingly clear. Each weed he pulled, each rock he removed, felt like an exorcism of a past regret. Each seed he planted was a silent prayer, a renewed commitment to the future. He'd watered, he'd waited, and slowly, painstakingly, things had begun to grow. Tomatoes, bell peppers, even a few squash vines that had threatened to take over the whole yard. Lily had helped him pick them, her laughter echoing in the evening air, a stark contrast to the strained silence that had once defined their interactions. Tom, ever the skeptic, had grudgingly admitted the homemade salsa was pretty good. That small garden, that tangible, living proof of patience and persistent effort, had become his quiet testament. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar business empire, but it was his. He'd built it with his own hands, nurtured it with his own time, and it provided real, undeniable value. Food for his family, a sense of accomplishment, a quiet communion with the earth that somehow grounded him. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves of the oak tree at the edge of their property, carrying the faint, sweet scent of wood smoke from a distant fireplace. It was a humble life, he knew. He wasn't driving a luxury car or jet-setting to exotic locales. He worked hard, long hours at a job that was often repetitive and physically demanding. His hands were permanently ingrained with grease and calluses. But when he came home, to this modest house, to Sarah, to Lily and Tom, to the subtle fragrance of his thriving garden, he felt a contentment that no amount of money had ever bought him. It wasn't the kind of happiness that burst forth in fireworks, but a deep, steady warmth, like coals banked in a hearth. Just last week, the old washing machine had finally given up the ghost, a critical household item, especially with two active teenagers. The old Dale, the one who'd prided himself on his wealth, would have replaced it with the newest, most feature-rich model without a second thought, probably on a credit card he could easily pay off. The Dale of now, however, had spent an entire Saturday afternoon poring over diagrams, watching online tutorials, and calling a friend who worked at an appliance repair shop. He'd found a broken pump, ordered the part, and spent Sunday morning with wrenches and a bucket, knee-deep in sudsy water until the old machine rumbled back to life. It wasn't about saving a few $100s, though that was certainly part of it. It was about the act of repair itself. The satisfaction of understanding a problem, breaking it down, and applying his own effort to fix it. It was about resourcefulness, about making do, about proving to himself that he didn't need to buy his way out of every inconvenience. That kind of self-reliance, forged in the fires of necessity, felt like a truer, deeper form of wealth than any amount of stored capital. He looked at Sarah, her profile soft in the twilight. "We'll be all right, Sarah." He said the words simple, yet imbued with a conviction he hadn't possessed in years. "More than all right. We're solid. We've got each other, and we know what we're made of." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, her warmth a comfort against the autumn chill. "I know, Dale," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know." The silence that followed wasn't empty, but full, brimming with shared history, unspoken understanding, and the quiet, enduring strength of a life rebuilt, brick by painstaking